Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Yellow Gloves podcast, your one-stop shop for all things Cage Warriors. Today we're going to unpack and break down everything that went down on Cage Warriors 176. So I'm recording this the morning after the night of, and it was a pretty good card in all honesty. We had some great fights, two fights that actually put in, well, one fight that I put in fight of the year in my shortlist, and then another which was really good for 2 rounds. But outside of that, we had obviously the prize fighter tournament, which was again pretty damn good, and George Hardwick defending his belt against Christian Iorga. But we'll start with prize fighter because that was the obvious headliner for this event. Omiel Brown defeats Burama Kamara via decision, split decision, of course, and managed to get to the final by knocking out Henry Linteler in round one. Just a typical Omiel Brown performance in that first fight against Linteler, assaulting to the body, just nasty work, body hooks, the lot, and managed to just overpower Linteler. There was a second there where, I was kind of holding my breath. For all transparency here, like I picked Omiel Brown to win this prize fighter tournament. The minute it was announced that he was in it and I saw everyone else that was in it, Emil was like my number one pick effectively. And when he fell into Linteler's guard and openly decided to go to the ground of him, I was a little bit concerned about how the fight would play out. But he managed to get that knockout, and then we'll talk about the main event now, which was of course him versus Kamara, split decision. Again, in the essence of being completely transparent, Emil Brown's one of my favorite fighters on the roster. I have been critical of him in the past, and I think that's something we should do. Even if we like fighters, we should still wear, and I'm sure he'd be critical of himself as well. But those fights, like against Skabinski, where he's, the IQ just isn't there for a fighter of his skill set. And obviously the Yanis Bakar fight was extremely disappointing. But again, one of those, it happens. You fight against a guy who's kind of this hard nosed banger, and you can get knocked out. But on a 3 fight win streak now, this Kamara fight, I personally thought Kamara won. I had it 30-27 Kamara, which one of the judges also had as well, and the other two judges scored it 29-28 Emil Brown. Having said that, I don't see a robbery here like at all. It was a very competitive fight. Round one was the swinger for me, in my opinion. I scored 2 and 3. I scored one to Kamara, but I could see one going to Emil Brown. It's both guys basically did the same thing for about the same portion of the fight. First half was all Kamara, second half was all Emil. I personally scored it to Kamara because I thought he dealt some damage in the start of that first round that Emil didn't overpower in his portion of the first round. Second round, I also scored at Kamara, and third as well. But I can see rounds one and rounds three going to Emil. I've rewatched the fight. I still think Kamara won. I still think it's 30-27. But Emil did well. Like he got clocked in round two. He got hurt and wrestled instinctively, shot for the double leg, and that really saved him in this fight. At that point, I thought he was going to get run over by Kamara, but I think he fought really well considering he's up against a guy who's 6'4", who's got I think it's an 80-inch reach advantage, or not reach advantage, fucking hell, but an 80-inch reach. And I think Emil fought well as the smaller guy. It's a tricky puzzle to solve, especially when you're trying to grapple, which Emil was doing a lot with Kamara. When they're that long as well, and they've got these long limbs, it's almost like a cheat code. But props to Emil again. I didn't think he won, but I don't begrudge anyone who think he did, including obviously the two judges, and I think he's a worthy winner. I tweeted this as well. I'm happy for Emil. I think it's a far more compelling winner for Cage Warriors and a cooler story when he fights James Sheehan or Yanis Bakar, the rematch, depending on who wins in that title fight on September 21st or September 20th even. For my money, obviously Kamara won. I don't think it would have been as compelling. Obviously, he's just come into Cage Warriors. We don't really have a distinct connection to this guy. He would have been right on my shortlist for newcomer of the year though if he'd won this. But again, all props to Emil. I thought this was another really good prize fighter tournament. I obviously preferred the bantamweight one. It was just a bit more exciting because there were pretty much all the names we knew who these people were. Whereas with this welterweight one, there are a lot of new names like Kamara, Kisic, Lintola, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it just didn't have that buzz and that hype for me going into it. But the fights were really good. I guess we can kind of just rattle off the prize fighter stuff, and then we'll move on to the other fights on the card. Before I do, though, Jack on Twitter asks thoughts on the tournament headlining over the title fight. I thought Hardwick would take priority. Yeah, it's interesting. I think because the card is built around the prize fighter concept, and it's not a new concept for Cage Warriors. They've been doing tournaments for years in this manner, but this concept, this branding of prize fighter is basically what the card is built around. So I'm not surprised that it takes that main event spot. It also allows the guys to recover long enough. If there's anyone who's a little bit tired or maybe harboring a minor injury that's not impeding them from fighting, but might be something they can sit on for an extra half an hour, an extra hour. It makes sense that it headlines over Hardwick, but I totally get where you're coming from. I mean, George Hardwick is the best rostered fighter in Cage Warriors for my money, and usually your best rostered fighter takes precedence over anyone else. But in this instance, with the tournament being such a new thing and something that they're pumping a lot of money into, and they're pumping a lot of branding and marketing into, it makes sense as well. And obviously, to keep talking about Kamara, he absolutely shut down Marco Kisic in his semi-final fight. Just a grappling, not a masterclass, but just an overwhelming grappling approach, just suffocating Kisic, gave Kisic nothing the entire fight. And obviously, we spoke about Omiel Brown and Lintola. Omiel Brown winning just shy of the second round starting. I think there were like 10 or 15 seconds left in the first round when he stopped Lintola. And then we had obviously the alternate fight between Sean Clancy Jr. and Rafael Aronov. The fight lasted less than 90 seconds. It went as predicted. Sean Clancy Jr. improving to 5-0, submitting Rafael Aronov with a really slick rear naked choke. I'm not surprised at all. I know obviously Aronov was a bit of like a live dog for a lot of people because he's dangerous despite being 6-6. He's a kill or be killed type, and there's always danger with those guys. Sean Clancy Jr. obviously one of my favourite prospects in the UK. Forget Scotland. This guy is just an absolute beast of a welterweight. Really exciting grappler. I've been talking about him for as long as this podcast has been running, really, 2.5 years of kind of just propping Sean Clancy Jr. up. And I'm glad he's finally in Cage Warriors and he's fighting these meaningful fights. There was obviously a lot of frustration from everyone, really. I was going to say from the Scots, but I think from everyone really about Sean Clancy Jr. not being in the main portion of Prize Fighter, like having to be an alternate. Obviously, as disappointing and as frustrating as it is, I think people need to realize that it's a live draw that Cage Warriors do. And I was gutted that Sean Clancy Jr. wasn't in the main portion of Prize Fighter, and I believe he should have been there, and I believe he probably would have won the whole thing. In all honesty, that's just my personal feeling. I would have loved to have seen him against someone like Lintola, seeing their grappling match up, and then matching up in the final against the Kamara or against an Omiel Brown. I think that would have been the cherry on top of the cake. But actually, I had a tweet from Invincible Woman on Wheels, and she says, if I see one more Clancy Jr. should have been in the main tournament, Cage Warriors fucked up, I'm going to scream. Talent wise, yes, but a random draw is a random draw, and Cage Warriors can't fix the draw for your guy. It's literally luck of the draw, 100%. This is it. We all wanted Sean Clancy Jr. in the prize fighter main portion, but it's a live draw, and this shit happens. Should it be a live draw, then that's a different conversation. And if people are frustrated about that, then fair enough. If that the card was in Glasgow, you would have wanted him to be the main guy in the tournament, but because they'd already done a live draw for the Bantamweight Grand Prix, they were never going to change that. Just to it would have been it just I don't know, a bit of malpractice really. Like, why would you do a live draw for one and then not do a live draw just to shoehorn a guy into a tournament 100%? So yeah, disappointing. But Sean Clancy Jr. is young. He was the youngest guy in the tournament. 5-0. He's going to make 50K with his eyes closed over the years. I can see him. This is what we're recording this on September 2024. Give this a couple of years. Sean Clancy Jr. might be in the UFC, could be collecting 50K bonuses with his eyes closed, right? So it's not the end of the world for him. I mean, if they ran another tournament in the future, I'm sure he'd be right up for it again. But yeah, outside of that, a tremendous win for him. Another first round finish, another submission. Sky's the limit for Sean Clancy Jr. at 5-0, and I cannot wait to see what he'll do next of his career. As for Omiel Brown, all the props to him. I don't want it to seem like I'm down on Omiel. He won fair and square. Like I thought Kamara won, but there's no foul play at hand. And Omiel looked really good in both fights. And I'm happier that he won than I would have been if Kamara won, in all honesty. Like I said, it's super compelling. It's the better result for Cage Warriors. It's the better result in general. I think the fights between him and Sheehan or Bakar will be a lot more interesting. So props to Omiel, 50K richer, title shot coming. Let's get into the rest of the card. Oh, actually, before we get into the rest of the card, two questions here from NDH330 on Twitter, who says, what weight class do you want the next prize fighter in? And who have you got in 2 weeks for the 170 belt? So, as we just mentioned, James Sheehan versus Yanis Bakar. I think James Sheehan will take it. My main concept here is that Sheehan absorbs a lot of damage, but deals a hell of a lot back. Yanis Bakar is extremely hittable, kill or be killed type. He's obviously incredibly powerful, and he might be able to put James Sheehan out of there. I can't see it happening. I think Sheehan's going to walk through some damage early, and he's just going to put a beat in and break Bakar late, maybe like a round 3, round 4, round 5 finish for James Sheehan. I think it's a favorable fight for him, and it kind of puts him in a position for fighter of the year contention for the Yellow Gloves podcast. I think Sheehan will get that done. And in terms of what weight class do I want the next prize fighter in, I mean, I'd love we know what the weight classes are going to be, but flyweight is the one for me that I really want to see happen. I think in Europe there isn't a better flyweight roster than what Cage Warriors have. There's some guys who are in Octagon who used to be in Cage Warriors, but the 125 division in Cage Warriors is booming. There's so many exciting guys. Nicholas LeBlanc, Shaj, I hope they rebook that. That's a tremendous title fight. You obviously got Sean Da Silva, and you've got a bunch of guys just vying for contention in that weight class, and a lot of veterans as well. That's I think 125 prize fighter would absolutely kind of blow the roof off any arena in the UK, in all honesty. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. And now let's definitively move on to the rest of the card. In the main event, we had George Hardwick versus Christian Iorga. George Hardwick obviously coming off that loss in Dana White's Contender Series. Again, I'm not going to kind of tread over the same path. I went on a huge rant when that fight was announced, but the fact that George even had to go through Dana White's Contender Series, he should have just been signed to the UFC. You run the risk of walking into a guy that, like Al Sawaldi, who's going to be able to outgrapple Hardwick, and a lot of people point to that. I remember people tweeting me saying, "Oh, Hardwick's been fraud checked." Not really, right? Like these things happen. If you gave Hardwick 3 or 5 UFC fights, he's coming out of there with a positive record, and that I'd be willing to bet my life savings on that. So the fact that he lost one fight and now he's no longer in the UFC mold is frustrating, right? I mean, I always say this, but from a selfish perspective, great. I get to cover George Hardwick on this podcast, and that's awesome. It was the same as Jordan Vucenic, it was the same as Paul Hughes, but it shouldn't be here. And I'd rather see them doing a madness in the UFC. Look at Nathan Fletcher, for example, right? He goes into tough, but he loses, but he still gets, obviously, like they always do, they still get fights afterwards in the UFC. Last night, Nathan Fletcher won via second round submission, and he's now 1-0 in the UFC. So all of these alternate paths of getting in, you'd want a guy to get more than one chance, really. And Contender Series should really be for guys who, in my opinion, are the up and coming prospects who may not have been regional champions, but may have really good records or good finishing instincts. George Hardwick was what, 12-1 going into that fight, already a champion in arguably the best promotion in Europe. It was bizarre. But anyways, George Hardwick, he's back many months later. I think it's 16 months or something like that. Back in action. Was supposed to fight in March, had a broken jaw injury, and he's finally here. Christian Iorga, his opponent, a relative unknown, 7-1 coming into this fight, a really good grappler. And we saw it in this fight. I scored this 50-45 George Hardwick. I thought it was an absolute striking clinic from Hardwick. He was, a bit disappointed at the end of the fight. I think he thought that perhaps he could have done more, and maybe he could have, right? Like, only George Hardwick knows what he could have done. But my opinion is that was just an absolute striking clinic. It's just great to see him back again. No one, parlays that left hook with a right hand over the top. I mean, no one does it like George Hardwick. The pressure fighting right off the bat, he was tremendous. For my money, he looked fantastic. Yes, he didn't finish the fight, but goes to the scorecards for only the second time in his Cage Warriors career, and wins it. Obviously, the other time was his loss to Fleminas many years ago, I think 2019. And obviously he was quite young back then, and Fleminas has always enjoyed spoiling the party for a lot of guys. But look, George put in a tremendous performance for my money. Iorga's tough as hell, and I loved his judo throws. I loved how he was initiating the grappling in these kind of awkward, unorthodox entries. It's clearly a fighter, and I think his style lends to this, but this is clearly a fighter who has a lot of luck on the regional scene, being crafty and unorthodox. But when he was trying to do it against a legitimately, in my opinion, world class operator like George Hardwick, it wasn't working for him. And props to him. He was very tough, stayed in the fight for all 25 minutes, took an absolute shellacking to the body and to the head. But George Hardwick, that's title defense number 3 for him. Again, he shouldn't be here, right? It was an absolute clinic once again from him. Puts another win on his record in Cage Warriors. I believe, his only loss again, to Madders Fleminas. And since he's been in Cage Warriors, since that loss, it's just been finish after finish after finish after finish. He's beaten top guys like Kyle Driscoll, Jan Lias, Chris Bungard as well, who's also on this card, and we'll talk about him shortly. But I don't know what's next for George. Like, do the UFC take another punt on him? Do they? I don't know what they do. There's no UK card, so you can't even. There is that Paris card coming up, but I don't know that they take a punt on a guy who they probably feel wasn't good in his Contender Series appearance. Does he have to wait again for the next season? Clearly, we'll see him defend this belt one more time, and if he does, I hope Cage Warriors just make it. Obviously, you don't want to create a situation where George has a really, really exciting opponent and it blows his chance of getting to the UFC if he loses. But at the same time, you want an opponent like that just to kind of show people that he's, again, the real fucking deal. Not that we've forgotten, but there are some people who have. I'd love to see George Hardwick versus Mason Jones. I think that's the fight to make, just out of sheer excitement, just out of sheer violence. I think that fight would be amazing, 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 amazing. And there's obviously other guys you could put in there, right? Like someone like James Power would be awesome to see, and Michael Pagani as well. But Mason Jones is the one, in my opinion. Do Mason Jones versus George Hardwick next year, and I think that has the potential to be one of the best Cage Warriors fights ever. And so hopefully that's what they do. But outside of that, another fantastic win for George Hardwick, and it's great to see him back in the yellow gloves. We'll cycle through the rest of this card. A lot of decisions that we'll talk about, but effectively we'll start with Andre Augusto versus Chris Bungard. Bungard trying to right that wrong of losing in front of his hometown last time out, and unfortunately it just didn't go his way. Andre Augusto comes in on short notice, misses weight as well, which It's always, you know, it's a grey area, right? You ask a guy to come in on short notice, he misses weight. It's a bit tricky to kind of beat them with a stick. But yeah, Andre Augusto for 15 minutes, just total domination of Bungard on the ground, got him down with ease, dominated him on the ground positionally. Didn't really beat on Bungard. Like Bungard didn't absorb a great deal of damage. Didn't really get put in any legitimate, submission attempts or anything. But Augusto just, yeah, dominated on the ground positionally and kind of cruised to a decision win. A few kind of, I guess, unsportsmanlike moments. Augusto punching Bungard to the back of the head 4 or 5 times. Referee takes the position away, but obviously doesn't deduct a point, which, is, they always say the first warning is before the fight, right? Is where when they're in the locker room, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, taking the position away, fair enough. Potentially could have taken a point. The other bit of unsportsmanlike conduct from Augusto was faking the glove touch in round 3 and diving for the double leg. Kind of unsavory behavior. But I think, as frustrated as people might be with that, the end of the day, man, it's a fight, right? And yes, it's shady. Yes, it's a bit shitty, and you hate to see guys like that prevail. But at the end of the day, it's a fight, and there's nothing in the rule book that says you can't do that. Is it unsportsmanlike? Yes, but again, not to be too cruel or too harsh, but I hate when fighters are touching gloves. Anyways, outside of the first round, which I can understand, like, okay, we're about to get into it. Touching gloves every round, or when they start hugging each other and stuff, like, yeah, just yeah, I don't know. It, not to excuse Augusto, I think it's shitty, and if I was in Bungard's position, I'd be pretty pissed. But at the same time, Bungard's a scrapper and he's a veteran, and I'm sure he's seen this many times before, so I don't think he'll be too pissed off about it. He'll probably be more pissed off with his own performance again, in Scotland, not really getting the job done. Unfortunate there, but props to Augusto. Controlled the fight, controlled Bungard on the ground as an underdog. Was Augusto in behind enemy lines, so fair play to him. On a more positive note, Reece McEwan scored the third round rear naked choke submission over Miguel Harrow. Boy, oh boy, was it good to see Reece McEwan back in the win column. You saw how much it meant to him. The performance wasn't tremendous, right? Like he dominated positionally for 2 rounds, gave Harrow little to work off. Harrow was very good defensively, but offering nothing offensively. But you could tell McEwan wanted to have his moment. Coming off 2 tough results, obviously lost in the title fight to Liam Gittins back in November, and Gittins really put it on him for all 5 rounds. And then the split decision loss to Cameron Else, a fight that I originally scored in Reece McEwan's favour, but then rewatched and scored it to Cameron Else. A split decision nonetheless, and could have really gone his way. But it was so good to see him get this submission here. The rear naked choke. It's typical Reece McEwan. I think it's his 5th career submission, 8-3 now. The outpouring of emotion at the end. I love that. When the fight ended, you could tell he was holding on to so much baggage, and obviously runs over to, I don't know who the woman was, but a family member, potentially a partner, and you could tell that kind of outpouring of emotion, how much it meant to him in the cage. He might not have been happy with his performance, but to win in the method that he did, in the way that he did, I'm just happy to see Reece McEwan back in the win column. I still believe in Reece McEwan as a contender at 135. I've not given up on him, and I don't think anyone should either. An awesome grappler, a really tough out for anyone, crazy chin. I think Reece McEwan's still in the mix, man, and I'm just so happy to see him get his hand raised here. Awesome performance, even though he's down on it. I mean, it wasn't. It's one of those where it wasn't awesome because it was exciting, because it wasn't. But it was awesome because he just completely shut a guy down, did what he wanted to do with Miguel Harrow for all 3 rounds, and then eventually sealed that rear naked choke. So I think a lot of positives to take away for McEwan. 8-3 now. Can't wait to see who they match him up with next. We'll continue with the winning Scots here because they go on a bit of a streak. Michael Blair defeating Kai Stevens by unanimous decision. This was one of the fights of the night. Third round was a bit dull, but the first and second rounds were just amazing. Kai Stevens drops Michael Blair not once but twice. once at the end of round one, which secured him the round in my eyes for Kai Stevens, and then once at the start of the second round. So Michael Blair gets dropped twice, still goes on to win this fight 29-28. I think this had one of the coolest moments of the fight where you felt like Michael Blair might be down and out, and then all of a sudden he rocks Kai Stevens midway through round two and starts to put an absolute beating on Stevens. Stevens is at sixes and sevens, wobbled on the feet, doesn't get dropped, but gets, you know, a genuine paste in. And you score that round for Michael Blair and the arena starts to go crazy. You can feel how, if Michael Blair had gotten that finish, I think the roof would have just shattered at the Braehead Arena. Third round was more just domination from Michael Blair, more controlled on the ground, controlling Kai Stevens, really not giving him an avenue to finish this fight, dealing some damage on the ground too. I think it's a tremendous, tremendous performance from Michael Blair. Don't forget, guys, he debuted last year in November, got knocked out in 22 seconds by Tariq Pell. That can change a guy's psyche, and he gets dropped at the end of round one. He gets dropped in round two. Can make a guy think, fuck, this is going to happen again. That resilience that Michael Blair showed, in my opinion, one of the best performances of the night, just based on the psychology behind it, and then being able to just go hammer and tongs of Kai Stevens, who was incredible, right? Like this was our first real exposure to Kai Stevens, who falls to 4-4 now. Incredibly, incredibly fast hands at 155 pounds off the back foot as well. Like he's getting the better of a lot of the exchanges, but once Michael Blair turned it around with that, I think it was a right hook that he just clocks him with in round two, and Stevens didn't look the same after that. Michael Blair, just an awesome pressure fighter, awesome mentality, incredible performance from him. We then had Keir Harvey versus Rory Evans. I know you're all laughing at me. Rory Evans is one of my favourite fighters in the UK. And, I try not to be biased to this pod, but Rory Evans is my guy. And it's disappointing to see him lose. And you're all going to sit here and be like, oh, here he goes, blah, blah, blah. I thought Rory Evans won, but I promise you, I'm not being a homer. I really genuinely believe that Rory Evans had won that fight, but super close, by the way. Like, don't get me wrong. I can absolutely see how Keir Harvey got his hand raised. But I scored the first round to Rory Evans. I think that was a very clear round. Harvey was defending the grappling well, but Evans was all over him on the ground. Round two, that was a really close one where you had, and I think this is the swing round. You had Harvey controlling Evans' back for a large portion of the round, but Evans throughout the round had all the submission attacks. They were all his. He had two submission attempts, had the ghillie and the mounted ghillie. He also had the strikes. Even though he was punching behind his head, he was still landing strikes. Keir Harvey's offense wasn't there for me, though the back control was obviously a more significant position than, jumping ghillie a couple of times. But I can see how that goes to Harvey. Round three, unequivocally, Keir Harvey's. I thought Evans took the first two rounds, but I can absolutely see Keir Harvey getting that one 29-28. No qualms of him getting that. Improves to 8-3. I thought he was very good. Like it's tough coming up against a grinder like Rory Evans. He looked great defensively in the grappling department. But yeah, a very close fight. Rory Evans obviously drops to 7-7, but he's always going to be my guy. He could be 20-20. He could be 20-40. The amount of killers this guy's fought, he says yes to fighting anyone, doesn't turn down a fight. He's fought an absolute murderer's row of UK MMA dogs, and he spoiled a lot of parties, man. How many times have we seen Rory Evans come in as an underdog and just smash people? So, yeah, Keir Harvey gets his hand raised. Props to him. Really good performance. Rory Evans, I'm sure we'll see him like 2 weeks from now, somehow sneaking onto a card on short notice to fight some killer and making a scrap of it. And our fight of the night, of course, to the surprise of absolutely no one, Damon Donald versus Kallum Parker. And what a fucking fight it was. Kallum Parker, again, another favourite of the pod, a guy whose record deceives the perception of his talent. People look at his record and think, oh, okay, this guy's a scrub. And actually, Kallum Parker is one of the most exciting guys on the roster. I've never seen someone just absorb so much damage and still look so cognizant of where they are. Doesn't ever seem rattled despite his face carrying so much damage. But in this one, it's unfortunately for Parker another loss. Damon Donald, oof, this guy right up there for me, newcomer of the year in my shortlist. If you thought his first fight was good, stopping Matteo Martignoni in between rounds, this one was incredible. Round one, Donald looked tremendous off the back foot. Like Kallum Parker was pressing in the way he does, but Damon Donald has an amazing jab while walking backwards, which is not an easy not an easy thing to have, right? Not an easy tool to have in your toolbox. But yeah, second round scored that one to Kallum Parker. Um, Kallum Parker dealt a lot of damage in round two, busted Damon Donald up, and I thought at this point Parker's going to take over and Donald's going to fade. But this is where you start to learn what guys are made of, right? Damon Donald joins Cage Warriors earlier in the year, just a 1-0 pro. We learn a bit about him against Martignoni. We know he hits hard. We know he's a fast striker. He's can fight out of either stance. And then we see him here against a scrapper like Kallum Parker, a guy who had a fight of the year with Luke Riley and another fight of the year contender here with Damon Donald. An absolute slugfest. Donald did get dropped in round two and was overwhelmed in round two, but rises in round three to put on a beating on Kallum Parker. Competitive third round, but really Damon Donald was the one dishing out the main damage. This guy could well be the real deal. He's obviously not super young. I believe he's 29, entering his physical prime, and he's just this guy's awesome. I mean, you guys can tell when I'm genuinely kind of gassed about a fighter, and yeah, Damon Donald's that guy. Like I could see this, I could happily watch this guy fight on a loop throughout the entire year. If they just throw him on every single card and just nerf all his opponents' damage, just let him absorb a little bit and just put a beating on people, I'd be there to watch it. Damon Donald, I think Scotland have a real, genuinely terrifying fighter at 145 pounds. As for Kallum Parker, 3-5 now, but we know records are for DJs because Kallum Parker is a dog and will always be a dog, and I hope we see him in there again. I'm sure we'll see him in there again. Just guaranteed value whenever he fights, guaranteed entertainment. Another fight of the year contender for him. But Damon Donald, he's one of the stars of the show, improving to 3-0. Will we see him again this year? Probably not. He took a lot of damage in this fight, but we'll see him next year. And look, he's right now he's the front runner for Yellow Gloves Newcomer of the Year. So let's see where we land 3 months from now. But maybe someone steals that shine. But Damon Donald, props to the guy. Amazing, amazing performance. Elsewhere in the prelims, more wins for Scottish fighters. Jordan Strong improves to 3-1 with a very quick knockout of Wesley Machado. Machado is always awkward but incredibly hittable, and Strong put him out in less than 2 minutes. Nice knockout there for Jordan Strong. First Cage Warriors win for him, jumps up to 3-1. He had the split decision loss to Jordan Little earlier in the year in just an awesome technical bout back and forth. Wesley Machado retires, drops his gloves in the cage. 9-fight pro, but an 11-year career, I want to say. Obviously, doing a lot of other combat sports outside of MMA, so there was a lot of breaks in his time, but never got his hand raised in the yellow gloves. Hard to give him the most amazing eulogy here, but anyone who goes in there, fights professionally, and absorbs the damage and has the highs and the lows, you got to give them credit. So, happy trails to Wesley Machado. That fight was all Jordan Strong. Made Wesley Machado look every bit of the, guy who had 1 foot out. Yeah, hopefully they match him up with someone a bit more resistant next. The Jordan Little fight was awesome. This one was just a walk in the park for Strong. I'm sure we see him again this year. I'm sure he's taken no damage. There's a few fights left. There's a card in Newcastle in November. Potentially we see Jordan Strong slot into one of those. We also had Ryan Campbell making his Cage Warriors debut against Sharam Hotak. Scored it 30-27 to Campbell, maybe 30-26. Dominated on the ground. Hotak was awkward off his back, but just a total mess fundamentally. Ryan Campbell was really not struggling at all, like passing the guard, dominating in mount, improving to 2-0. He's got really good grappling chops. Hotak was very weird. I'll be honest, I don't want to kind of drag the guy too much, but was throwing, had these opportunities, had the butterfly guard, wasn't sweeping at all, had kept playing with this rubber guard, but really doing nothing with it. And Ryan Campbell was just passing every time, passing through, getting into half guard, into side control, passing into mount with little resistance, a total domination on the ground. Like I said, potentially 30-26. I scored it 30-27. But yeah, that's a debut win for Ryan Campbell and his second professional win. The Aussie from Sunderland, Charles Joyner, also got his hand raised, improving to 4-1. Not the most exciting bout against Brandon Guest, mainly because it was just well managed by Charles Joyner. 6'8", he's got this long reach, and he fought behind it. Every time he tried to strike in combination, Brandon Guest would clock him, and he realized that early in round one, and he was like, cool, I'm just going to keep throwing these roundhouse kicks to your body, beating up that midsection, and I'm going to jab at you periodically, and you're not going to be able to close the distance. He banked on himself and, dealt some damage on Brandon Guest. And look, Brandon Guest making his pro debut, but don't get it twisted. 7-2 as an amateur, fought in the IMAFs. Clearly, a good operator in the cage, and I'm sure he'll go on to have a good career at only 26 years of age. But Charles Joyner, using his physical traits, using his qualities, putting them to good use, and scoring that 30-27, fought smart and composed. Now 4-1 and 2-0 in Cage Warriors. So Charles Joyner definitely one to watch at light heavyweight. The last fight we'll talk about, which is of course the first fight on the card, was Ryan Hewitt versus Reggie Hingston. Anyone who's listened to the pod knows I rate Ryan Hewitt massively. He's had 2 fights in Cage Warriors, and despite being 0-2 in the promotion and coming into this fight 1-2, he looked great in both fights. He was beating Ander Sanchez until he got heel hooked late in round 2. He was competitive against Jer Harris, who's one of the best bantamweights in Cage Warriors, one of the most exciting guys. I'm saying bantamweight, sorry, one of the best flyweights in Cage Warriors, coming off an amazing fight with Joanne Scott. So look, Ryan Hewitt's not had the best of luck, but he's looked awesome. And when you look good consistently, eventually the wins will always come. And I've been saying it for a while, and here it was, Ryan Hewitt scoring the first round KO with a disgusting, nasty roundhouse kick to the body. Just genuinely fucking vile. Like, I obviously wasn't in the arena, and I forget who tweeted me, or I'll find it here. Erimus Sports tweeted me saying it sounded like a gun had gone off in here. Nasty. So obviously, they were at the event, and yeah, I mean on the broadcast it was gross enough, but it just sounded like he said, like a gunshot. To me, it sounded like a baseball bat. Nasty work from Ryan Hewitt. He was always going to get this finish. Hingston looked decent, but Ryan Hewitt just looked like a man out for blood, and he got that. I'm so happy to see him win. Improves to 2-2. He's going to be dangerous at 125 for a lot of guys. Again, like I always say, Cage Warriors flyweight division is stacked, and it's also because of guys like this, right? These scrappers, these kill or be killed types, like Ryan Hewitt is. I'm sure we'll see him in there again very soon, and I hope we do. Props to Ryan Hewitt. Very, very happy for the guy. And that wraps up Cage Warriors 176 in Glasgow. 50k in a title shot for Omiel Brown. George Hardwick defending for the 3rd time. Good to see some prospects getting back on the horse, like Reece McEwan. Also seeing the birth of some legit fun scrappers like Damon Donald, someone like Jordan Strong, Ryan Campbell, Charles Joyner. And also on top of that, getting to see Sean Clancy Jr. do his thing again. 5-0, one of the best prospects in the UK, like I always say. This was a really fun card. It didn't run long, a nice tight 14 fight card, really enjoyable. And look, this prize fighter thing is a total success for Cage Warriors. Hope that obviously we continue seeing it. I know it's obviously scheduled in for the rest of this year, but beyond this year. Obviously, money permitting, it would be great to, at least if they did it once or twice. I think it's an awesome concept. The roster's big enough for it. It's exciting enough for it. And yeah, I really hope they continue doing it, because as a spectator and as someone who covers it, it's really fun to cover. So yeah, props to Cage Warriors. Another awesome card. The next one will be Cage Warriors 177, which is an unplugged card on Friday, September 20th, and then Saturday, September 21st. They're basically running back-to-back cards in Manchester at the BEC Arena. On the 21st, you've got Andy Clamp defending his belt against James Webb, which is going to be really, really fun. James Webb going for a second title, which would be cool. Obviously, former middleweight champ, potentially getting his hands on the light heavyweight belt. But I don't know that Andy Clamp is going to roll over so easily. Yayan Davies also fighting on that card. And then on the unplugged card, we've got Angus Hewitt, Michael Chamu, which we know is going to be just insanity. Orlando Wilson Prince versus Solomon Simon. Yes, please. Riri Hudson coming back. And then you've got the title fight, which we've already spoken about a lot on this pod. James Sheehan versus Yanis Bakar. Very excited for that one. Kind of a jam-packed September here, so you're going to be hearing my voice a lot. So apologies in advance. But if you did enjoy this episode, like I said at the start, please consider leaving a rating, a review, sharing it. It really does help. And if you want to join in on all the conversation, tweet me at Yellow Gloves Pod, message me on Instagram at Yellow Gloves Pod as well. I'm always happy to chat anything UK MMA or European MMA, especially Cage Warriors, with anyone. And yeah, if you enjoyed listening, like I said, consider being nice and sharing it around. Thank you very much for tuning in. As always,